Hi, Binh Rey here. Welcome to the second episode of Export 101. Today we're going to be looking at strategies for export market entry, and we've got a special expert today, Boban Tomic, and he will be going through some of the issues that you need to consider before exporting. So stick around. Hi, we have Boban Tomic from tomic&company today, and I'm so excited because he is an expert in international trade, and he helps companies expand overseas, supporting them to find new markets as well as growing their brands overseas. So please welcome Boban, and Boban is going to just tell us about his experience and let us know what he's done overseas to assist customers.
Okay, great. Thanks, Binh. Obviously, any company wishing to look at the international market will know that there's plenty of opportunity there. I mean, the mere fact that Australia is less than 0.5% of the global population is a basic statistic which works in our favour. So huge opportunities, but at the same time, a lot of hard work. But what I think is probably the key point, key decision that any company needs to make is whether that objective, that international expansion, is more a tactical opportunity or a strategic opportunity. And depending on that decision, there's a lot of work behind the scenes that needs to take place to support either of those options. Because if you go tactically, then that's a little bit more opportunistic. But if you want to go longer term, build a brand, then there's a whole set of activities behind that. I guess also, as we know in Australia, diversification is very critical. So I like to look at markets as a portfolio, which if you're in 10 markets, maybe 3 or 4 of them are cash cows, 3 or 4 of them are stars and you're working on it. And you can look at another few that are more like tactical opportunities where you can seed your brand or your product in that market and then over time build up some good volumes. So yeah, there's plenty of opportunity out there, Binh.
And just tell us briefly about your background to why your experience makes you an expert in this area of export international trade.
Okay, well, I was fortunate enough to spend over 16 years internationally working in Asia, Europe and Africa. In fact, my last role was with a company called CFAO, part of the Toyota Tsusho group, as MD in West Africa. So after 16 years, I came back to Australia just at the time of COVID, actually. And I was thinking about what my next step would be, and I thought that's a great platform, a great opportunity to use my experience and contacts to help companies move internationally.
Excellent. I think before we had this meeting, you mentioned that you had a factory in Africa producing these big pens. So I guess that experience would also give you insights to how you set up, a company to sell into those African countries.
Yeah, well, in my role as MD with CFAO, we had a manufacturing, CFAO and Toyota Tsusho Corporation had a manufacturing operation in Ghana. Yes. In fact, they were part of a broader group which was present in nearly every African country. But that brings me to probably the first point in any international strategy is the product selection side. So if you're an enterprise and you look at the portfolio that you've got, I guess it's a key consideration which product would be most suited to international markets, which product from a profitability point of view in terms of your whole portfolio makes the most sense. And where you've got manufacturing capacities, with raw materials and so on, that you can follow up with a very successful strategy. Some markets which are quite large, if you do make the right moves, you can get some substantial scale and volumes, and then you'll need to back up that success with production volumes and good capacities. So the product selection side, I would say, is probably the starting point in terms of, also what's good fit in the different markets. Yeah.
Well, in the previous episode, Cynthia mentioned that before you even consider going overseas, even if you're a successful company in Australia, it's really important to really research your market and which countries you may want to enter in. So considerations like product selection, market selection, is very important. And so I was hoping that you can expand on those 2 points and maybe give us some examples about product selection and market selection.
Yeah, okay. Well, I guess we've touched on, I guess, the product selection side in relation to getting the right product for the market, making sure you've got the manufacturing capacities and so on. But in terms of market, I guess the starting point would be the economic opportunity.
Yes.
You know, the size of the market, looking at some of the financials, you know, whether there's a free trade agreement or, you know, the purchasing power in those markets. That would be one level. The next is really the geographic aspect. So, you know, what's the proximity like? We work a lot in Asia, and it's great that it's close. So you can save a lot of time in terms of speed to market. You can save a lot of time, and then freight costs and so on, which are quite topical. So I think there are 2 levels. And the third point in terms of market selection is really the cultural and consumer aspect, making sure that the product, you know, is a good fit in the market. And you know, even things like language, making sure that you move maybe first into a market that speaks the language. I guess an example would be Ghana, which is a great entry point to West Africa and 400 million consumers. Ghana, you know, English speaking, 30 million people, great market, you know, good security and quite a well-developed market. So that would be an example of, although the proximity is not that favourable, in terms of market entry into Africa, aside from South Africa, that's another good market to look at for sure.
Fabulous. Well, the other thing that I think we forget as well is we may think that the product that we produce in Australia is doing really well, but when you go overseas, you actually have to scope out where the competition is and whether that market is too saturated to actually sustain another product or services. So can you comment a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. You know, the competition. I guess the starting point would be the segments you're playing in.
Yes.
You know, whether it's premium, mainstream, or value segment, and then looking at the players in the segment. So there's some, let's say, technical or strategic assessment of where you want to go with your brand and the positioning and so on. But what, and of course, you know, the research is required in the market and so on to know exactly what the competition's doing. But what I find particularly relevant is a strong and in-depth understanding of the market in terms of the spirit of the competition. You know, in West Africa, I use that example, or even in Eastern Europe. A lot of the competitions, it's quite fierce and they're very agile and fast and they're hungry and a high sense of urgency. So competing against businesses like that, whether it's international or local, is really important to understand. And that's why I support what I term strategic exporting, which is seeding your product in a market and then just over time, step by step, learning the market, modifying, understanding how the competition is operating, and then working to a 5-10 year time frame. Because you need to really understand, obviously, how the market works. And you know, again, in Africa, for example, you've got a lot of whether it's Lebanese or Indian or Nigerian corporations, which are really fierce in terms of the way they operate. So as an Australian business, you've got to find your space. You know, in the premium wine category, for example, we've got great products, great brands. So if we go in premium segment and we manage and build the brand in the right way, we can really get some traction. So the competition is really a key one for sure.
I wonder what bubble tea would do in in Africa, because that bubble tea concept came from Asia, Taiwan. It's come to Australia. It's been a big hit. But what if, you know, a bubble tea manufacturer here wants to, let's say, open a chow time in South Africa? How would that work? You know, so again, that would be looking at whether, as you said, product selection, market selection, and whether the consumers would accept such a new concept. And then also look at the competition. Is there a bubble tea shop in South Africa at the moment, or in Africa?
Well, I'm not quite sure about that category, but I like your thinking. You know,
maybe I could open one.
Yeah, exactly. But I like your thinking of thinking outside the box, being innovative, and looking at, you know, at the end of the day, it's about the consumer experiences. You know, if they're drinking, let's say, soda-like beverages. Then maybe they'd be open to a bubble tea format. And also, whilst the product category could be really interesting, what's also important is the pricing. You know, are you at the right price for the right market? What's the format? you know, which market do you move into?
Yeah.
A lot of companies, international companies, are even looking at a city-based strategy.
Yes.
So rather than going, let's say, to you know, a whole region, they'll say, okay, I'll go for this one big city.
Yes.
And
just to test it out, right?
Focus there, testing, or even focus for a few years.
I mean, even if we look at locally, I think I've heard that Boost Juice started in Adelaide, and Adelaide is like a testing city for any new franchises. So I'm assuming you could probably adopt the same sort of strategy when you go overseas. But by going overseas, I often, in my line of work, which is I'm a trademark attorney by day and a presenter at Import Export TV now.
You're very versatile. Congratulations.
Thank you. I often get clients wanting to go overseas, and they often say, I want to go to 8 countries at once. I want to trademark in 8 countries. And I go, wait a second, that's going to cost a lot of money to get trademark protection. Why don't you just take a few steps back and just go, which country are you really going to enter now? And then take the time to make sure that maybe your product or service is actually going to be successful instead of just scattering their money, entering 8 markets in one go. So that's sort of what you've been talking about today, you know, product selection, market selection, and also, you know, eyeing your competition in those markets.
And also, sorry, Ben, also my initial sort of decision for the corporation looking to go overseas is that strategic decision. Is it tactical or is it strategic?
Yes.
So if you're looking at a strategic entry into a certain area, then there's a lot of considerations around that, you know, the investment, the brand building, because you can trade. Building brands is longer term and requires a lot of other activities that can, you know, require the right mix of resources, including the right distributor and partners on the ground and so on. So, whereas tactically, you know, you can push some product into a market, get a commercial advantage, and you know, it's a low involvement sort of effort. But really on the strategic side, you've got to, as you say, test out the market, understand it, and then bit by bit grow volumes from there.
Well, there's a lot of online e-commerce companies in Australia that initially have made money out of just selling internationally via Amazon or any of those online commerce platforms. But what they're finding is that the overseas consumer isn't really wanting to purchase, because by the time they pay for the freight, it's as much as what the product has cost is. So they're actually having to reconsider the strategy, expanding overseas by maybe appointing a distributor over there and having them purchase a whole container load to save up on freight, and then having, I guess, salespeople on the ground. There's in marketing, you know, the 4 Ps. What was it? The price,
place, and promotion.
That's correct. So that sort of applies to if you're exporting as well. So that leads us to the last point that you said that was really important, was pricing. How do we price the product, even though it may be priced here at a different price level? Maybe you, as you said, when you go overseas, you might want to price your wine at a premium. But in Australia, maybe your wine isn't seen as a premium. So is that what you were talking about pricing?
Yeah, well, I think it's all part of, let's say, a considered review of all the elements, as I mentioned, the market segments you're in, and then the pricing. And the starting point there would be the retail selling points, for example, in the consumer goods space, and then reverse engineering the value chain to see what the margin structure looks like, to see whether, in fact, the value chain can work for all the stakeholders. Because irrespective of the model, you need to make sure that all the stakeholders have their commercial sort of benefit in the whole let's say, project. So taking the price point in a segment and then reverse engineering the margin structure to see whether it works, I think is a pretty critical point.
So when you do pricing, is there like a rule of thumb that if it's a consumer product that you need to mark it up by 200%, to take into consideration all the cost that's involved to get it there? Or as you said, you reverse engineer it and say, well, this is a price point I want, and then you look at all the costs along the way to get the product to the shelf. And then you look at, well, that margin's too small now. Maybe I need to increase my price. So where do people, if they're looking at exporting, start looking at pricing?
Well, I think the price of your product in the segment that you're looking to enter, and I think one term that often a lot of international companies use is what they call benchmark indexation.
Okay.
So, for example, if you've got a local leader in a brand in a particular category, you may say, I will index my product at 90% of that price, or even 75%, because the local player could have a lot of awareness and you know, a lot of loyalty, so you can't be on par. So you can't have parity. So you can pitch it at let's say 90% indexation or 75, and that could be a methodology for international indexation of your product versus the market leader. And then you work back from there in terms of how the margin structures look like. You know, so that's sort of they're the consideration. Of course, in terms of margin benchmarks, you know, whether it's importer, distributor, and other stakeholders, there are benchmarks that you can use from the market itself. And I find a lot of companies assume what the actual margin structures are, and then they get caught up when the product hits the market and you know, they're 10-20% over the target competition, and their product's not selling, and then they find themselves in a bit of a bind. You know?
It just shows you that you have to actually go through that pricing exercise.
Yeah, exactly.
Because why would you produce a product, sort of go through the exercise of exporting it, getting it there, and realize that actually you're not going to make a profit out of it, so you might as well scrap that product in the first place in terms of consideration of exporting it. Yeah,
for sure. So I will do some quick and dirty research on the pricing in the market, in the category and segment that you're looking for. Do some numbers. If they stack up, you can see there's space there, then you can go a little bit more deeper into it. I think the pricing is pretty critical. And then, of course, making sure your product costings are okay with everything going on in terms of inflation. You've got to look at a sustainable price point, because if if your cost of goods is $1 and then 6 months down the track it turns to $1.50, how do you maintain the price point? And it's a
bit tricky right now, isn't it, with all the cost of freight?
For sure. And then we haven't even got into the discussion around currency volatility and the cost of financing, and there's a whole lot of macroeconomic aspects that can hit on the pricing. So finding that sweet spot that's sustainable is a challenge. I always think it's good to price maybe a little bit higher, and then you can play with some rebates and incentives to motivate the partners that you have in the chain and to achieve the price points you need.
Well, the government has many. I think they've got the Market Export Grant, which allows people. Is it the Market Export Development Grant? Yes.
Export Market Development Grant.
That allows companies in Australia that goes overseas to claim back up to 50% of the costs that they incur looking at going overseas. But with that grant, you have to actually project what you want to spend a year in advance to be able to claim it back. So that's actually a great grant for Australian companies to look into, and we'll probably put that in the show notes so that you can actually go and research more yourself. But yeah, so it sounds like, I think the message to Australian companies wanting to export is, don't just think about shipping products overseas. You actually have to take a step back and look at your strategy. And part of the strategy is to look at product selection within your range, market selection, competition, making sure that your product in the market that you want to enter into isn't saturated. And lastly, to make sure that you actually make a profit at the end of it, this whole exercise of exporting. And I think you mentioned earlier in the segment that it is rewarding once you get it right, because there's scalability overseas. There's more population overseas. The market is bigger than in Australia.
And in emerging markets, the growth rates that you can get could be 15-20%. You know, over like a 5-year CAGR could be quite attractive. So it's worth the effort. But yeah, for sure, there's work to be done.
And I also I always believe that you have to go and seek out the expert that's already actually done, has already gone overseas, because effectively you would have made mistakes initially, and because of your mistakes you've learned from them, and that's why we're all experts. We're not export experts when we start, and so part of your role, I guess, in helping customers, companies going overseas, is to ensure that they follow a structure, have the strategy right,
Yeah.
and you will help them avoid the pitfalls of exporting.
Yeah, and I think just to conclude on
Yeah.
that point, there is the theory, which we've discussed,
Yes.
and then there's the practice.
Yes.
And as you said, you know, being in the international markets for such a long time, and the mistakes we made and the successes we've achieved enables you to share those learnings, you know, with Australian companies that would like to go overseas.
Yes.
So I'm sure we can support from that point of view.
Excellent. Well, thanks for being here, Boban, today, and I hope you've enjoyed this episode. So don't export until you do your research, okay?
Yeah.
See you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.